Good evening and welcome back to Starlight Sleep Tales. In the autumn of 1228, a ship came to rest in the harbor of Acre, and from it stepped a man who had come to win back Jerusalem for the Christian world. He wore the cross of a crusader on his shoulder. He commanded armies, ruled two kingdoms, and carried the title of Holy Roman Emperor. And yet the Pope, the very man who was supposed to bless such a journey, had recently declared him cut off from the church, an outcast, a soul condemned. He had arrived to fight a holy war that the holiest authority in Europe had forbidden him to wage. It is one of the strangest stories the age of the Crusades ever produced. Before we drift into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It is a small thing, but it helps other sleepless people find their way here too. And there is something quietly comforting about knowing that someone in another city is settling in under the same story tonight. So get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, and let yourself ease towards sleep. Tonight we are drifting into the story of the Sixth Crusade and the emperor who tried to take the holy city without a battle. The man on the dock was Frederick I. To his admirers, he was the wonder of the world, a ruler who spoke many languages, who kept scholars and astronomers at his table, who asked questions that made bishops uneasy. To his enemies, he was something close to a heretic in a crown. He had spent more than 10 years promising to go on crusade, and more than 10 years finding reasons not to. Now at last he had come, and the timing could hardly have been worse. The Christian states clinging to the coast of the Holy Land were weak and divided. The great wave of crusading energy that had carried earlier armies east had thinned to a trickle, and Frederick himself was traveling under the shadow of his own church's anger. The world he stepped into was not the world of the First Crusade more than 100 years. Earlier, when knights had stormed the walls of Jerusalem in a fury of blood and faith, that city had been lost again to the great Muslim leader Saladin in 1187, and the Christian hold on the region had been shrinking ever since. What remained was a thin ribbon of fortified towns along the Mediterranean coast, places like Acre, Ty, and Tripoli. They were rich trading ports full of merchants from Venice and Genoa and Pisa. But they were not the kingdom that the old songs remembered. The Crusaders called this surviving territory outri, which meant simply the land beyond the sea. Frederick had not come as a stranger to the idea of holy war. He had taken the crusading vow years before at his coronation in Germany, in a moment of public enthusiasm. Such vows were serious. A man who took the cross and then failed to go was breaking a sacred promise, and the church watched these promises closely. Frederick had renewed his pledge again and again, always meaning to leave next year, next season, after this one last problem at home was settled, and the problems at home never seemed to end. What made his situation so peculiar was that the conflict he carried with him was not really with the Muslims of the East at all. It was with the Pope. Frederick and the papacy had been circling each other for years. Two powers that each believed they should stand above the other. The emperor ruled lands that wrapped around the Pope's own territory in Italy, to the north and to the south. And a strong emperor was always a threat to a pope who wished to be free. So when Frederick delayed his crusade one time too many, the new pope a fierce and elderly man named Gregory IX, seized the moment and excommunicated him. To be excommunicated was to be shut out of the sacraments, cast beyond the community of the faithful, told that the gates of heaven were closed. For most men, it would have been a crushing blow. Frederick simply sailed anyway. That decision is the heart of our story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you everything about the man. Most rulers of the age would have begged forgiveness, performed penance, waited for the curse to be lifted before daring to fight in God's name. Frederick did not. He had made a promise to go to the Holy Land, and now that he was finally ready to keep it, he was not about to let the Pope's anger stop him. There was a certain stubborn logic to it. He had been punished for not going. Now he would go, and let the punishment sort itself out later. The Crusaders already in the East did not know what to make of him. Here was the most powerful Christian ruler alive, arriving with troops and prestige, and yet he came branded as an enemy of the Church. The military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, those famous warrior monks who guarded the roads and castles of outrally uneasy. Their loyalty was to the Pope. To follow an excommunicated emperor felt like a betrayal of everything they had sworn. Some held back, others watched and waited to see what he would actually do. And what he did would astonish all of them. Frederick had not come to drown the Holy Land in blood. He had come to talk. He spoke Arabic. He understood far better than most Western princes that the Muslim world was not a single faceless enemy, but a tangle of rival rulers with their own quarrels and ambitions. He believed that a clever man, a patient man, might win by negotiation what others had failed to win by the sword. It was an idea that struck many of his contemporaries as almost shameful. A crusade was meant to be holy violence, a cleansing storm. Frederick proposed something quieter, and to some minds far more troubling, which was an arrangement. So as he stood on the dock at Acre, the pieces of a very unusual drama were already in motion. A divided Christian camp suspicious of its own leader. A Muslim world weakened by its own family feuds. A pope back in Italy fuming at an emperor who had defied him. And in the middle of it all, this restless, brilliant, difficult man who had spent his whole life refusing to do what was expected of him. To understand how he came to this moment, we have to go back. Back past the crusading vows and the quarrels with Rome. Back to a small Italian town and a baby born in a tent in the marketplace. A child who would lose both his parents before he was 4 years old and inherit a crown that half of Europe wanted to take from him. The story of the Sixth Crusade is really the story of Frederick himself, and that story begins not in the Holy Land at all, but on the sunlit, dangerous island of Sicily, the orphan of Palmo. Frederick was born on the 26th of December in the year 1194 in the town of Jesse in central Italy. His mother was Constance, the heir to the kingdom of Sicily, a woman already in her 40s, which was unusually old to be having a first child in those days. There was so much suspicion about whether the baby was truly hers that she is said to have given birth in a tent set up in the town square, with the women of the town invited to watch, so that no one could later claim the child had been smuggled in. Whether the story is exactly true or not, it captures something real about Frederick's beginnings. From his first breath, his legitimacy, his right to rule was something that had to be proven and defended. His father was Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, a hard and ambitious German ruler from the great Hohenstaufen family. Through his father, Frederick was heir to the empire that stretched across Germany and northern Italy. Through his mother, he was heir to Sicily, which in those days meant not just the island, but also the southern half of the Italian mainland, a wealthy and well-governed kingdom that the Normans had built. To hold both at once would make a man master of nearly all of Italy, and that was precisely the prospect that frightened the popes for the rest of Frederick's life. A child who threatened to surround the papacy on every side was a dangerous thing to have wandering the world. The danger came early, but not from his enemies. It came from death itself. When Frederick was only 3 years old, his father Henry died suddenly of a fever far too young, leaving the empire in chaos. The German princes were not willing to simply hand the imperial crown to a toddler in Sicily, and so the inheritance from his father slipped away into a long and bitter struggle that would not be settled for years. Then the very next year, when the boy was barely 4, his mother Constance died as well. In the space of a little more than a year, Frederick had gone from the heir of 2 crowns to a small orphan in a turbulent kingdom. With powerful men in every direction calculating how to use him, Constance, before she died, made a desperate and clever choice. She named the Pope Innocent III as the guardian of her son and the protector of his kingdom. Innocent was one of the most powerful popes who ever lived, a brilliant lawyer and politician who believed that the papacy should stand above all the kings of the earth. By placing Frederick under his protection, Constance hoped to shield the boy from the German nobles and the local Sicilian lords who would otherwise have torn his inheritance apart. It was a reasonable gamble. It also meant that Frederick grew up as the ward of the very institution he would one day spend his life fighting. In practice, the protection was thin. A pope in Rome could not watch over a child in Palmo every day, and Sicily in those years was a place of constant disorder. Rival nobles, German mercenaries left behind by his father's armies, and ambitious officials all fought over who would control the young king and his treasury. Frederick was crowned king of Sicily as a small boy, but the crown gave him little real power. The men who were supposed to govern in his name governed for themselves instead. There are stories, hard to confirm, but widely repeated, that the boy was often neglected, sometimes short of food and proper clothing, left to wander the streets and markets of Palmo, while the great men squabbled over his kingdom. If those stories are even partly true, they may help explain the man he became, a pampered prince raised carefully behind palace walls learns to expect the world to arrange itself for his comfort. A child left to fend for himself in a busy, dangerous, many-tongued city learns something else. He learns to watch people closely, to read their motives, to survive by his wits, and to trust very few. Frederick grew up sharp, observant, self-reliant, and deeply skeptical of the authorities who were supposed to be caring for him. These were not the qualities of a comfortable man. They were the qualities of a survivor. Palmo itself was the perfect classroom for such an education. It was one of the most remarkable cities in all of Europe, a place where worlds met and mixed in a way that existed almost nowhere else in the Christian West. The Normans who had conquered Sicily had not swept away the cultures they found there. Instead, they had ruled over a population that included Latin Christians, Greek-speaking Christians of the Eastern Church, Arabic-speaking Muslims, and Jewish communities, and they had let much of that variety survive. The result was a court and a city unlike anything Frederick's father's Germany could have shown him. So the boy who would one day negotiate with a sultan in Arabic was, in a sense, raised to do exactly that. He heard Arabic spoken in the streets and in the palace. He saw Muslim scholars and Greek officials working alongside Latin clerks. He grew up in a world where a person's faith did not automatically make them an enemy, where knowledge and skill could come wrapped in any language. For a child destined to lead a crusade, it was a strange and fitting beginning. Most crusaders learned about the Muslim world only when they arrived to fight it. Frederick had grown up inside a fragment of it. He was a quick and hungry learner. By the time he reached his teens, he had picked up several languages, read widely, and developed the restless curiosity that would mark him for the rest of his life. He wanted to know how things worked, why animals behaved as they did, how the stars moved, what the philosophers of different faiths had argued. This was not common in a young king. Most rulers were trained to ride, to fight, and to command, and left the books to their clergy. Frederick did all of those things and then went looking for the books as well. As he grew toward manhood, the great question of his inheritance still hung unanswered. The imperial crown of his father had been claimed by others. In Germany, a rival named Otto had taken the throne, and even won the Pope's support for a time. Frederick was a king of Sicily in name, a young man with a glittering bloodline, and almost no real power beyond his island. But the wheel of European politics was about to turn in his favor, and the same Pope who had guarded his childhood would soon decide that this clever Sicilian boy might be exactly the tool he needed to bring down a troublesome emperor in the north. Frederick's true rise was about to begin, a kingdom of three faiths. To understand the man Frederick became, it helps to pause for a moment and walk through the world that raised him. Because Sicily in those years was genuinely unlike anywhere else under a Christian crown. The island sat at the center of the Mediterranean, a stepping stone between Europe and North Africa, between the Latin West and the Arab and Byzantine worlds. Trade flowed through its ports, ideas flowed with the trade, and the people who lived there belonged to several different worlds at once. The Normans who had taken Sicily in the 11th century had been wise enough, or perhaps simply practical enough, to keep what worked. The kingdom they built ran on the talents of all its peoples. Arabic-speaking officials managed the treasury and the tax records using administrative methods inherited from earlier Muslim rule. Greek-speaking clerks and churchmen carried on the traditions of the Eastern Christian world. Latin lords and bishops brought the customs of Western Europe. The royal court itself was a blend of all three, and a visitor might hear Latin, Greek, and Arabic spoken within the same set of walls in the course of a single day. This was the society Frederick grew up reading like a book. Now, this is the one moment in our story where it is worth looking closely at how the different ranks of people actually lived, what they wore, what they ate, and how they fit together. Because Sicily in this period shows the medieval Mediterranean world in miniature. At the top stood the king and the great nobility. These were the men who held land, commanded soldiers, and surrounded themselves with luxury. Their clothing reflected the island's mixed, culture in the most vivid way. The Norman kings of Sicily wore garments influenced by both Byzantine and Islamic fashion. Robes of heavy silk embroidered with gold thread, sometimes decorated with Arabic inscriptions woven right into the cloth. There is a famous royal mantle from this world covered in images of lions overcoming camels, with a border of Arabic writing made in the royal workshops by Muslim craftsmen for a Christian king. A nobleman of this rank ate well with spiced meats, imported, fruits, almonds, sugar, and rice, foods that had come into Sicily through the Arab world and that most of Northern Europe had never tasted. Sugar in particular was a marvel grown on the island itself and used in ways that would have seemed impossibly extravagant in a German castle. Below the great lords came the lesser knights, the merchants and the skilled townspeople. The merchants of cities like Palmo and Messina grew rich on the trade that passed through their harbors, dealing in cloth, spices, grain, and slaves. A prosperous merchant might dress in fine wool and good linen, eat meat regularly, and live in a stone house in the city. The craftsmen, the weavers, the metal workers, the builders, the makers of those gorgeous silks formed a respected middle layer of society, and many of them were Muslims whose families had practiced their trades for generations. Their skill was valuable, and so for a long time they were protected. At the base of it all were the farmers and laborers, the great majority of the population, as they were everywhere in the medieval world. They worked the land, grew the wheat and the citrus and the sugar cane, tended the olive groves and the vineyards, and lived simply on bread, vegetables, cheese, and whatever their fields and animals provided. Meat was a rare luxury for them. Their lives were governed by the seasons, the harvest, and the demands of whichever lord held their land. Among these working people, too, the three faiths lived side by side, Christian and Muslim villages, sometimes within sight of one another, paying their dues to the same crown. What held this mixed society together was a fragile arrangement of tolerance backed by the authority of a strong king. As long as the crown was powerful and even-handed, the different communities could coexist. Muslims could practice their religion, keep their own judges for their own legal matters, and live under their own customs in exchange for loyalty and taxes. It was not equality as we would understand it today. The non-Christian communities lived under restrictions and paid for the privilege of their faith. But compared to much of Christian Europe, where such communities were often persecuted or expelled, Sicily was remarkably open. This was already changing by the time Frederick came of age. The long years of disorder during his childhood had strained the old balance. Christian settlers from northern Italy were arriving and pushing against the Muslim population. Tensions that the strong Norman kings had managed were beginning to break into open conflict. In time, Frederick himself would deal harshly with rebellious Sicilian Muslims, relocating great numbers of them to a settlement on the Italian mainland. Even then, the relationship was complicated rather than simply hostile, for he also recruited Muslim soldiers into his own guard, men whose loyalty to him personally could not be undermined by the Pope, since they did not answer to the Pope at all. For a ruler whose relationship with the Church was always uncertain, troops who stood entirely outside that quarrel were a practical advantage. The intellectual life of this world left an even deeper mark on him. Sicily and nearby southern Spain were among the great gateways through which the learning of the ancient Greeks, preserved and expanded by Arab and Persian scholars, flowed back into Western Europe. Works of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that had been lost to the Latin West for centuries were being translated and studied. Frederick drank all of this in. He gathered scholars of different faiths at his court, sent questions to learned men across the